Guys, have you ever had this conversation with somebody?
Yeah, I'm a Christian. Oh, really? So does that mean your God is into genocide and murder? Doesn't he kill a bunch of people in the Old Testament?
If you've ever had a conversation like that, or if you've ever just wondered yourself, today is for you. Let's get into Judges. So last week we started in verse 1 of chapter 1, and now we should continue in on that verse. So it says, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, who of us should go up first to fight against the Canaanites? This brings up two questions. Who are the Canaanites and why are they supposed to kill them? In order to answer this question, we have to go back and talk about the history of the Canaanite people. So who are the Canaanites? In order to figure out who the Canaanites are, you need to know about three people. There's Noah, a guy named Ham, and a guy named Canaan. Noah was a God-fearing man. He was the one that built the boat, the ark, all that. And Ham was his son. So Ham was not a very good guy. And you can read about him in Genesis chapter 9. And because of Ham's sin against Noah, God cursed Ham and thereby cursed Canaan, who is Ham's son. So a whole line of people were actually cursed because of what Ham did. Now, that might sound really cruel of God, but we have to all remember that we're all cursed because of Adam's sin, right? Adam was the first human, and because of his sin, we are all cursed. We're all under the sting of death, and so yeah, it's not a foreign concept for God to do this. Another thing we need to know is that the Canaanites were not an innocent people. No, they were actually an idolatrous, wicked group of people. Now, something interesting in Genesis chapter 15 is that God actually gave the Canaanites and the other people groups in that area a certain amount of time to repent. So in Genesis 15 verse 16 it says, God is saying to Abraham, in the fourth generation your descendants will come back here. So that's what Judges, the book of Judges is about them returning to this land that God promised them. And he says in verse 16, for the sins of the Amorites has not reached its full measure. So God actually gave these people, the Amorites, and later on in the passage it talks about Canaanites and other people groups, he gave them a certain amount of time to repent and to turn to him. And if they didn't, he promised that he would actually wipe them out. So later on in the passage, we read about a specific example of the Israelites defeating a really pagan king, and his name is Adonai-Bezek. So it says in verse 7 that Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off have picked up scraps under my table. Now God has paid me back for what I did to them. So in the verse before, it says that the Israelites caught this king and actually did the same thing to him. They cut off his thumbs and big toes. It's interesting that we would look at this and see that it is cruel and unjust, but this king does not. He says that this is God's way of paying him back for what he did to those 70 other kings. So it might be helpful for you to realize when you're reading this book and it talks about Judah, Simeon, the Danites, Benjaminites, a bunch of those people, the Knights, they're the good guys. They are all part of the people of Israel. Now, we need to talk about partial obedience. God told them in verse 2 that Judah should go up and fight against the Canaanites. But what does Judah do? They invite the Simeonites to go and help them. So they are obeying God, but they're kind of not at the same time, right? They're adding to what God said. And then later on, in the end of the chapter, there's tons of examples. In verse 27, Manasseh did not drive out the people. Verse 28, when Israel became strong, they pressed the Canaanites into forced labor, but didn't drive them out completely. So again, Israel, instead of obeying God's perfect command and law and just for their betterment, right? He knows what's going to happen. Instead of obeying God, instead of driving them out, we'll just force them into labor. We're going to make them our slaves. And we'll see that that does not work out at all. So what is our take home for today? I'm going to be real with you guys. For me, when I was out of high school, one of the ways that I did this, one of these partial obedience things, one of the ways I kept my sin around because I thought I could control it, was through media consumption. I wanted to be educated on what people were watching, and so I started watching YouTube and a lot of videos and social media stuff that really wasn't helpful for me. And it became an addiction in my life. And unfortunately, I thought I could control it, and I realized I couldn't. So maybe you have something like that in your life, a sin or an addiction or something that you are going to instead of God to fulfill you. And you keep that thing in your life because, well, it does bring you some measure of happiness. I just want to remind you that in the end, these things lead to death. And we will see that in the book of Judges.